what happened? Oh, thank you, Dai. What happened when Zhu Yanzhang died?
War broke out.
Right, yeah, fighting's going to break out, conflict. Right, can be a serious problem. When you have all the power focused on one person, like the emperor, and the Chinese political system is focused on this one person, what happens when the emperor dies? Now, the problem here was that the emperor had his first son, if I recall correctly, had already died before him. So he made his son's first son his heir. So it was his grandson. His grandson was not very old. So he dies, and in steps this guy, and that causes some chaos. Well, why? Well, who was this guy, Younglun? What was his relationship to Zhu Yanzhang? He was one of his sons. So he was the uncle, right? He was the uncle of the heir, right? So Younglun was one of the sons. Now, what's really tricky about Chinese rules of succession is it's not strictly, it doesn't have to be first son to first son. So from our perspective, if you're used to Western ways of monarchy, this makes sense that it would be it would go to the grandson and not to the uncle. That's not how it works in China or Korea or other Confucian countries. You could move around based on who was best suited to rule. So this is tricky. So Younglun is going to then seize power from, right, Zhuo Yunzhang's grandson. Right, and then he will become the third emperor. Right, the first emperor is Zhu Yanzhang, then you've got the grandson who I didn't name because it gets really confusing, and then Younglun will seize power. And, the person, I'll talk about why I think this is problematic shortly, but the person, Michael Wood, who presented that, is really critical of Younglun. Right, he's really hard on Younglun for doing this. I'll talk about why that's problematic later. But for now, first of all, who was Feng Zhaoru? Who was this guy? Yeah, he was an official. He was a minister. He was a high official. By the way, David, did you know this story? Is this popular in China today, the story of Feng Zhaoru?
I know it.
Yeah, I think that's something every Chinese person learns, right? Yeah. This is, so when you're learning that, that's what's kind of fun about this class. If you ask a Chinese person who this guy is, they'll say, oh yeah, I know who this is. And of course, how does Feng Zhaoru respond when he's asked to write an edict saying that this is the new emperor?
He doesn't.
Yeah, he doesn't. Because I would rather die. And so the emperor supposedly punishes him not just with death, but kills a bunch of his relatives. Now, I don't know how true that part is. The story I heard is a little bit different. And the story I heard, Feng Zhaoru is the one that says, why not make it 10? There, in that story, was the emperor. In any case, the emperor is very upset about this. So what does this tell us then about the relationship between officials and emperors? Or let me start over. Why did Feng Zhaoru do this, ostensibly? I'm sorry, I just can't hear you.
To give advice.
Right, to give advice. Officials have the duty of remonstration, of giving advice. So in Chinese political theory, the emperor is the top, but that doesn't mean the emperor is always perfect. Remember, the emperor can lose the mandate of heaven. So loyal officials, I use the term loyal on purpose because you're supposed to be loyal. Loyal officials are supposed to give the emperor advice even if it is risky to them. Right? Loyal officials are supposed to give the emperor advice, and okay, there it is. Even if it's risky to them. Right? So, and also, remember, we talked about how husbands can remarry, but ideally women should not remarry if their husbands die. So out of loyalty to the old emperor, Feng Zhaoru says, I will not serve you because you killed the real emperor. Right? You overthrew the real emperor. I don't care if you kill me. That's being loyal. Right? That's what an official is supposed to do. So an official, the relationship between officials and emperors is complex, as you saw in that reading. Right? The officials are supposed to obey emperors, but they're also supposed to do what they think is best for the emperor. And that might mean disagreeing with the emperor and challenging the emperor, and they have to be willing to put their lives on the line. There's one of my favorite stories, there's like a Chinese official who challenged the emperor, and when he went to court, he brought his own coffin with him, meaning he expected to die. Right? I think that's pretty cool. And I just want to highlight, my Chinese is very poor, my ability to write characters, but I believe this is the character for loyalty. Right? This is made of two characters, right? This is what I think is so much fun about Chinese, how it works. And of course, Koreans and Japanese do this too. But it has two characters. This is center. And this is when we talk about China being the middle kingdom, you add this to country, and it becomes that. So this is center. This is heart. So this loyalty, what is the center of my heart? Right? So it helps you think about what that means. So that's, not all Chinese characters do that, but that is one that does it ideally. So officials can challenge emperors. They're expected to be loyal to the death, though. So it's very complex. And emperors, they can punish officials, but they're also expected to listen to officials. So it's a very, very complex relationship, which you saw in that wonderfully passive-aggressive reading that you were asked to do. Now here's the thing where I think Michael Wood is looking at this from a really Western perspective. Right? It's clear here that Feng Xiaoru is the good guy, Yongle is the bad guy. I don't think it's that simple. Right? I don't think it's that simple. The dynasty had just been established. The dynasty had just been established. It's relatively weak. There's a saying, and this is in Chinese and Korean, for a dynasty to be established, you have to have 3 generations of emperors. There's lots of dynasties that lasted a very short time. So the dynasty is still unstable. That's one reason there was so much fighting and chaos. Yongle was afraid that if he let the grandson in charge, he could not handle things, that the dynasty would fall apart. You can't have some young kid who doesn't know how to rule, who doesn't have political connections, who doesn't have connections with the army. You can't leave that kid in charge. The dynasty will fall. Therefore, I have to step in and seize power for the good of the dynasty. It's also my own good, of course, because I need to be emperor. But at the same time, we also have to recognize Feng Xiaoru, it's easy to see him simply as a hero. But you know what? Officials like having child emperors, because child emperors do what the officials tell them to do. So it's very easy to think of this story, and I want to tell you this so you understand how complex Chinese politics are. This can easily be told, as Michael Wood did there, as a story of good versus evil. Yongle is the evil tyrant, Feng Xiaoru is the good official. But it's complex, right? Because Feng Xiaoru is also kind of self-interested, because he can dominate the young emperor. At the same time, Yongle is seeking to the good of the dynasty. We need a strong ruler. So again, these things are complex, and I want to kind of do that exercise because it's easy to judge China according to Western political traditions, and we have to be careful about doing that because it can help us it can lead us to misunderstand China. Once you understand, then you can judge, but not yet, if that makes sense. So we need a powerful emperor. We need a powerful man on top to maintain order, to make sure we have justice. And I just want to point out, what purpose did the altar of heaven serve? What was this supposed to do?
A site for sacred ritual.
Right, it's a place for sacrificial ritual, right? That ties together what?
What did you say?
Dylan?
Earth, humanity, and the cosmos.
Excellent, yeah, exactly. So there's this idea of harmony. But remember, we have to have harmony through hierarchy. Excellent job, Armir and Dylan. There's Feng Xiaoru, right? That's him there. And then here's, I believe this must be his tomb. Right, I know this character. Yeah, that's his tomb. Have you been here? Or is this a place you go to? Yeah, it'd be interesting to check that out. Okay, good. Now, they didn't really mention it in that video clip, so I want to build on that. So it's like, why would you move the capital? I mean, part of it's this idea that, again, Michael Woods, he kind of emphasizes, I think, the negative about Yongle. You know, oh, he had to move the capital in order to build this place that emphasized his own authority. But remember, he's doing this for the dynasty, too. It's not just for him. And he also wants to, part of it is that, of course, emphasizing your own authority. But that's necessary in Chinese political theory to keep things together. But I want to emphasize, right? So he moves from Nanjing up to Beijing. What's the saying? Keep my friends close, but
My enemies closer.
there's Mongolia. Remember, when China last got conquered, it was from the north. Remember, China is big. They don't have instantaneous communications. If you want to keep an eye on the people up north, you need to be in the north. So that's a key reason, was security. China had been invaded from the north and had been taken over. And guess what? Next time that China gets taken over by someone, it's also from the north. Not from Mongolia, but from Manchuria. So this makes a lot of sense. Right? So there is a kind of self-aggrandizement there. There is an attempt by him to solidify his power. but he is also thinking in terms of the good of the country. And in a place like China, which puts so much emphasis on this single person ruling, it's easy to conflate those. My good is the good of my country. Right? The more power I have, the better off China is. That's kind of the the Yongle Emperor's philosophy. Very different from Western political philosophy, easy to miss that. And he emphasized how the Forbidden City is this kind of hierarchy, it shows his power, but I want to emphasize the emphasis on harmony. The goal here, you have to have someone on top, because hierarchy brings harmony. But I don't think, in many ways, this is impressive, but it's not necessarily meant to overawe you. It's harmonious. Look, symmetry. Everything, from the Chinese perspective, should be symmetrical. This is the Forbidden City. Notice it's almost perfectly symmetrical. You can fold it on itself. That's supposed to indicate harmony. That's the basic goal that you're going for. And from the Chinese perspective, you've got to have hierarchy. Everyone's got to know their place if you want harmony. And so again, I want to step back for a second, now that we're talking about the Ming, to understand how the Ming saw the world around them. And this is going to be very important as we progress. They saw China, as we've already talked about, as the center not only of the world, but of the universe. Remember the altar of heaven, the place where heaven, earth, and the cosmos meet. That's where the Chinese emperor performed rituals. The emperor is the son of heaven, and he's the only one. There are no other emperors. The Chinese hated the fact that the Japanese emperor claimed to be an emperor. Did not like that one bit. They couldn't do anything about it because they weren't. China was a land power, not a naval power. But they didn't like it. So remember, we had this idea that Chinese culture is equal to civilization, is equal to morality. And there's this idea that you have, so from the Chinese perspective, you don't have equal states. Governments are not equal to each other. There's China, and then there's varying degrees of not China. Right? There's one emperor in this world, he's in China. There can be other kings, but kings are below emperors. And typically, these kings were supposed to give tribute to the emperor, to the Chinese emperor, and accept the Chinese emperor as overlord. Koreans did this. Korea historically had a king, and traditionally gave tribute. It was very smart of Korea to do that, because by recognizing China as their older brother, as their overlord, China would not invade, would not conquer them. So Koreans got to maintain their independence. So just because you accepted China as your overlord did not mean you lost your independence. Lots of countries did that. One thing that's kind of funny too was this was often used as an excuse for trade. When you sent a tribute mission to China to offer tribute, that gave you an opportunity to engage in trade. And a lot of people could make a lot of money that way. What I think is really funny is sometimes people pretended to be from countries that didn't exist in order to offer tribute and receive gifts and engage in trade. So some guy would show up in Beijing and be like, yeah, I represent King Wenceslas of Ural-Potamia, and here's some gifts, here's some tribute he wants to offer, can I trade now? And the Chinese are like, we know that that's totally fake, but you can hang around, that's fine, you can trade. Right? So it's kind of funny, I think, but that's how that worked. Now, what's the big deal about tribute? Well, tribute gives legitimacy to the emperor. Right? Tribute gives legitimacy to the emperor. So let me just, and I'll come back to that. Well, I just want to highlight, and I'll continue with this in a second. This is bold, underlined, in italics because I added this to the PowerPoint. So Korea accepted China as its overlord. Japan did not. Japan did not. Japan said, we got an emperor. He's just as good as the Chinese emperor. There's a famous, I think it was during Tang Dynasty, China, like 7th and 8th century. You know how we call Japan the land of the rising sun? Sun rises in the east and sets in the west. The Japanese emperor sent a letter to the Chinese emperor that said from the emperor of the rising sun to the emperor of the setting sun. The Chinese were not happy about that. Right? You can see the symbolism, right? We're rising, you're falling. So it's kind of cheeky, right? The Japanese would borrow from China and then use it to say, hey, we're really better than China. So it's kind of funny. Very interesting relationship. So tribute gives legitimacy to the emperor. Right? Tribute gives legitimacy to the emperor. Now, if you're not familiar with the concept of tribute, I want to give you a concrete example. Remember how I mentioned I had a professor who was my advisor in Korea? Right? So this is me visiting his office. This is his building, basically. I don't think I mentioned this, but he's in charge of what's called the Guksa Pyeongchan Wiwonhae, which is like the National History Institute. It's basically like, it's a vice ministerial position, so it's like right under a secretary. So they have like their secretary of Defense and Secretary of Commerce, he'd be right under that person. So he was a pretty high official. I think this is his office. All this is his office. So I was just astounded, right, when I went in. So this is me getting ready to visit him. And two things about this. This was a day, like in Korea, it's a small country that's very centralized. So they have like a national broadcasting network that you can sign into with your phone, and it sends messages to people, like with warnings. And that day they gave a heat warning. And I said to my friend who was accompanying, I'm like, well, they gave a heat warning. How do I need to dress? Because usually I should wear a sport coat and tie to visit him. She's like, I think you need to keep the coat, but you can drop the tie. So, heat warning, don't go outside, doesn't matter, I gotta walk here, dressed like this. And notice what I've got in the bag. I got a bag. Guess what's in the bag? Tribute, which is alcohol. Right? I should offer him alcohol as tribute. And that's what that does. And that's us with my colleague and I with Dr. Cho in his fancy office. And if you watch Korean dramas, his secretary looks like he stepped out of a drama, because the guy was just immaculately dressed and everything was my tie is always slightly off, and my stuff comes from Kohl's. But this guy, I mean, he was just astounding. Yes, Robert.
When you say a heat warning, what kind of range are we talking about, out of curiosity?
I don't recall, to be honest. I just know it was hotter than all get out. Fortunately, we were lucky because when we actually had to walk, it became overcast and a little stormy. So it turned out not to be as bad as we thought, but I just want to highlight that, it was like, well, I have to respect him, so it doesn't matter how hot it is. But of course, look how he's dressed, right? He gets to dress down because he's on top, right? That's the idea. But here's the point. When people see that kind of performance, you say, this guy's really important. Like I heard people kind of ooh and ah when I said this was his office. And it's like, okay, Dr. Rausch is a professor, but I have to kind of, respect him like this. You're like, wow, this guy must be really important. So the way that tribute works, right, imagine this, people come from other countries giving gifts to the emperor. And while I should bow to him and I have to use like a certain speech style that shows that I'm below him, when you met the emperor, you got down on your hands and knees and hit your head on the ground 9 times.
Top down, right.
Right, kowtow. Yeah, so it's serious stuff, right? You have to get up and down, up and down, up and down to show your respect to the emperor. So imagine if you're a Chinese person and you're watching that. People come, they offer this tribute to our emperor. Our emperor is really important, right? These Koreans come and do that. These Vietnamese come and do that. These people from the Ryukyus, Okinawa, they come and do that. We got a really cool emperor. We Chinese are awesome because all these other countries are coming and paying respect to our emperor. Isn't our emperor awesome? Isn't China awesome? That's basically how this works. Now, there was a guy in the Ming Dynasty named Zheng He. Right, Zheng He, and if you've taken my classes, I talk a lot about Zheng He. But Zheng He was an admiral. I want to stress he was not an explorer, he was an admiral. And he worked for Young Le. Right, so when you hear Zheng He, think of Young Le. Right, rhymes help. Anything you can do to help remember Chinese names, I think is helpful. Young Le, Zheng He, they go together. But Zheng He is going to lead multiple expeditions, multiple journeys outside of China. Right? Notice he stays close to the land, but he's going to go to places like India, to Southeast Asia, Africa, and Arabia. He doesn't go out exploring. He knows where he's going. Right? He's not going out there to explore. What he does, though, is he brings items, material goods from these places, and people to offer tribute to the Young Le emperor. So Africans, Indians, Arabians, people from Southeast Asia representing different governments are going to be brought back to China by Zheng He. And they will say, so you'll have, and I want to stress, most Chinese people had never seen an African or an Indian person. And then these people who, they're clearly human beings, but wow, do they ever look different than us? They've come all the way from these distant places to offer tribute to our emperor. Isn't our emperor awesome? Isn't China awesome? We should support our awesome emperor. Right? That's how this works. Right? This helps give political legitimacy. And that's why one of the key reasons why Young Le did it. Right? He's going to send out all these expeditions. They're going to bring people back, offer tribute. Remember, I said it's very dangerous when you first form a dynasty. This makes the dynasty look really good, so people are more likely to respect it and obey it. Now here's the thing that I think is very important. This is, I believe, the Santa Maria, one of Columbus's 3 ships. This is one of Zheng He's treasure ships. He usually traveled with several dozen. Now, I have to stress, bigger isn't always better. They make this comparison. Columbus is like, oh, look how big these ships are. See how awesome these ships are. They are awesome, but for exploration, smaller ships can actually be better. But the key thing I want to emphasize, China is very wealthy. These ships had, like I said, Zheng He would go out with several dozen of these ships with thousands of sailors. Columbus is going with 3 ships and several hundred. So this shows us the power of the state. And if you're familiar with European history, you know that Europeans started off the age of exploration up here, and they went around Africa and down like this. Well, isn't China just doing the same thing in reverse? I mean, theoretically, there's nothing stopping the Chinese from just doing the same thing. Right? So even though Zheng He is not an explorer, had the Chinese wanted to, they had the technical ability to go out and start exploring themselves. They don't. I'll talk about why they didn't shortly. I added this. Because they don't, this leaves the field open to Europe. So Europeans are the ones who are going to go out trading, conquering, and becoming fabulously wealthy. And that's going to help drive the scientific revolution. Right? That is going to help make Europe so powerful. We don't have time, this isn't a class on Europe, but I just want to emphasize the fact that the Europeans are able to go out and explore and learn about all these different places and build up these trade networks and these empires, over time it's going to make the Europeans so powerful. And of course England, which took a leadership in this role of exploring, is going to be one of the most powerful. It's going to really give China a hard time. So why didn't China continue doing this? Why did they stop? Right? We know from hindsight how much has helped Europe. Well, remember, their purpose was to obtain tribute, political legitimacy for the Ming Emperor. They did that, so why bother continuing to do that? It's kind of like, you kind of think about it this way. I think this is kind of interesting. The United States, what was the political reason why we wanted to put a man on the moon?
Say we did it.
Yeah, say we did it, and the Russians didn't. It was out of the Cold War. Right? Especially, remember, we got freaked out when the Russians put Sputnik into space. Right? But then it's like, okay, we got to show that our system is better than theirs. And then we stopped. Right? Isn't it kind of funny? It seems like when the Cold War wound down, we kind of stopped with space exploration. But now that there's more competition with Russia and China, we're stepping up our space exploration. And they have different systems than ours. Same thing here. This is expensive. We did it. Why continue? We got the political legitimacy. We did it. And also there was this fear it might bring in barbarian influence. It brings in non-Confucian ideas, ideas that are inferior to our ideas. Right? So why would we do that? We want stability. We don't want these new ideas. New ideas are dangerous. That may seem weird to us, but we will talk about later how new ideas were dangerous for China. Also, this is complex, but broadly speaking, Confucians did not much like trade. They didn't really trust merchants. So they didn't see how you could become really wealthy through trade. Europeans saw that, clearly, which is why they encouraged exploration. China did not think that way. After all, they're so big, they're so powerful, why do we need to bother with this anyway? You know, this is kind of the problem when you're on top. You get complacent. I'm being too shallow in a sense of this analysis, but that's kind of the idea. China has everything. Why would we need to waste money and resources to do this? And oh, by the way, why are we spending resources on this? We need to be worrying about the Mongols or those people in the north because they're the danger. And they're right because, like I said, this dynasty gets conquered by people from the north. So sadly, the records of Zheng He's voyages will actually be burned, and they're forgotten about for several hundred years before people rediscover what wasn't destroyed. Right? So it's really kind of what could have been. But this helps us to understand one reason why China will fall behind. They're on top, they're doing so well, there's just not that need to do something else. And there's a tension, right? We tend to think innovation is good, but change threatens stability. And I hope one thing we've made clear as we've looked at the Chinese political system is stability is extraordinarily important. That's what you're aiming at. So pre-modern China traditionally chose the former. I am sorry. Chose the former for good reason, because instability overthrows dynasties. We don't want that. Let's just keep doing what we're doing, working fine. All right, some really quick announcements. So in general, people did fairly well on the old reading quiz. If you did not, make sure you use the study guide, reading guide, right? That's a big thing. Take your time, read it carefully. If you still struggle after doing that, please do let me know. I'm happy to help you with that. But as a 300 level history class, this course does demand a fair amount of reading and that people understand the reading. One thing I also want to tell you is that the next week's readings are a bit more difficult. Nothing is as passive-aggressive as that other one, but this one does not include comics. Right? So the first one is from a book called The Death of Woman Wong. It's just one chapter. I used to assign the whole book. I thought it's better just to focus on one chapter. And it's a chapter called The Feud. And it gives us an understanding of Chinese traditional concepts of justice and the difficulties that government officials face. A lot of it is from a government official's perspective. And also there are some interesting things on gender. The other is a comic based on the novel The Good Earth by Pearl Buck, a 19th, early 20th century missionary to China. She wrote a very interesting book talking about Chinese peasants. And this is a graphic novel based on that. So I hope you'll enjoy that. The review quiz, people generally did well. Remember my policy on missed quizzes, if you miss, you can miss up to 2. And if you tell me the day of class, the day after the quiz was due, I will reopen it up to 2 times. So if you didn't take the quizzes, email me by the end of the day today and I will reopen it. But remember, you only get to do that twice. If you're struggling, remember to see me during office hours or go to tutoring. We will hopefully start section 3 on Wednesday. I'm eternally hopeful. Maybe I shouldn't be. But in any case, if you print out the PowerPoints, that's something to think about. Tuesday at 3:45 p.m. is convocation. That opens the year. All the professors come out dressed up, so it's kind of funny to see us in our robes. That is a fouls event, right? So if you need fouls, that's a good one to go to. Dylan?
Where is that, in the auditorium?
No, I think it's actually in the Finest Horn Arena. It's not in the auditorium.
Okay.
So starting in section 2, Fall of the Ming and Rise of the Qing. So our objectives here, we're going to try and understand the dynamic nature of the Ming Dynasty in Chinese history. We're also going to try and understand why the dynasty was unable to successfully complete reforms and then fell. And we'll also try and understand why a foreign dynasty would be established instead of a Chinese, that is Han one. It's complex because in this time period, Manchu were not considered Chinese, but now Manchu are considered Chinese. So they've gone from being foreign to being Chinese. So very complex. I don't know if you know this guy, Neil Ferguson, but he makes a lot of documentaries and writes a lot of popular books. And he made a documentary about China. And like a lot of things that are documentaries that he makes, I have problems with them. But he's entertaining as all get out, right? So I guess that's what's important for making a documentary. But I want to play a clip for you. And as you watch this clip, I want you to catch, why does he think that the Ming Dynasty falls? Right? What does he give as the explanation for why the Ming Dynasty falls?
While Europe was a patchwork quilt, China remained a vast monochrome blanket. Not even the most pretentious European court could match the Ming dynasty's authority. The Forbidden City in Beijing is just one vast monument to the unity of imperial power.
Just take a walk from the Protecting Harmony Hall to the Middle Harmony Hall where the Emperor had his private quarters, to the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where Dragon Throne itself sat. Harmony, harmony, harmony. It's a kind of code word for unity, for undivided imperial authority.
This simply had no counterpart among the fractured and competing states and cities of 15th century Europe. In China, imperial rule was implemented by a Confucian bureaucracy, recruited on the basis of perhaps the most terrifying set of exam papers in all history. This photograph is of the Central Examination Compound in Nanjing. Thousands of wannabe mandarins would be locked in these cells, just 3.5 feet deep, about the same width, and only 5.5 feet high. During the time an examination lasted, the only movement allowed was the passage of servants replenishing food and water supplies, or removing human waste. Some candidates went completely insane under the pressure.
No doubt after 9 long days shut in a shoebox, it was the most able, and certainly the most indefatigable candidates who passed the imperial examination. But this was an exam that rewarded caution, even conformity. It was competitive, certainly, but not the kind of competition that fosters innovation, much less the appetite for change. Confucius said, among other things, that the common man marvels at uncommon things. The wise man marvels at the commonplace. But maybe there was just a bit too much that was commonplace about the way that Ming China was governed. And in a world that refused to stand still, that was a recipe for trouble. Big trouble. Great empires and complex things. For centuries, they can bask in a sweet spot of power and prosperity. But then, often quite suddenly, they can collapse.
Let's look again at what happened to Imperial China. The Ming Dynasty had been born in 1368. And as we've seen, for more than a century after that, Ming China was the world's most sophisticated civilization by almost any measure. But then, in the mid-17th century, the wheels came flying off. Political factionalism, fiscal crisis, and famine opened the door to rebellion and invasion. The results were devastating. Conflict and disease reduced the Chinese population by as much as 40%. In 1644, the last Ming emperor hanged himself out of shame. This dramatic transition from Confucian equipoise to anarchy had taken little more than a decade.
All right. So, I had some people doing some really good participation. So, if you haven't spoken yet, why did the Ming Dynasty fall according to Neil Ferguson? Just give me one reason. People haven't yet spoken. Yeah, Chris?
A series of calamities.
Right, yeah.
In what, like 40 years?
Yeah, the immediate cause. It was actually a decade, he said. Like in a decade, we had all these calamities. Right, that's what caused it. That was the immediate cause. Right. Yeah, Robert?
He also seems to be blaming like the lack of innovation and change.
Yeah.
Like, I think it says like the exams kind of encourage that way of thinking.
Yeah, excellent. So the Chinese, right, they don't change when they're supposed to. They don't innovate when they're supposed to. Right? They focus so much on unity and harmony that they get stuck and they won't make any changes. And then all of a sudden, then everything falls apart. He's really wrong, I would argue. I think he's really off about this. If you're especially if you're a history major, you've been kind of trained to know how he's off, because we talk about how there's lots of causes. It's not just like, okay, there's just this kind of simplicity. There's this idea that the exams are causing people not to think, right? Just causing them to conform. But what did you learn in this class about the exams? What was one thing I stressed about the exams that would encourage, that helped to govern? He doesn't mention. Who could pass the exams? What did you have to be? Yeah, exactly. Intelligent. You had to be smart. They made sure they had smart people in charge. And they also made sure that people had become familiar with the accumulated wisdom that had helped people to rule for so long. Right? So it's not so simple as that. The exams worked really, really well for a long time. People tend to look at that and say, oh, this doesn't encourage innovation. As we'll see later, there's lots of innovation and lots of dynamism. And that's why I want to stress the question. Notice how I phrase this. We're going to understand why the dynasty was able to successfully complete reforms. It's not that they refused to reform. It's not that the Chinese didn't change. They tried, but for various reasons, they weren't able to complete the reforms. That's a very different kind of thing. And this is one kind of stereotype Western people often have of traditional China or Asian societies. They're unchanging, they're just stable, and they can even be stagnant. I would argue that that's very wrong. Why it's wrong, though, we'll talk more about on Wednesday. So I'll see you all then.
Very aggressive in the video.
Oh, Neil Ferguson?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's just how that's just, it's kind of edutainment. It's supposed to be like edgy and like, and I like the older style documentaries. I mean, it's exciting. I mean, he's made like 5 or 6, and I've made 0. So, I guess there's something to that. But yeah, that's like, it's just like, why did you show that Incan mummy or Peruvian mummy all of a sudden, right? It's like that wasn't necessary.